Good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of Happy Hour with the Historian. My name is Clint Howard and I'd like to welcome you all here for our premiere episode. Tonight's episode is going to be dedicated to Mrs. Sylvia Crosby. She was a longtime docent and a very dear friend who recently passed away. Tonight we will be discussing our bicentennial edition of Up from the River. My guest historians here are Bob Carius, Diane Tebbetts, and Mike West. They will be going over the book and giving us a wonderful history lesson. If you do happen to have any questions for our historians, please type that into the chat and we will go over those at the end once they have gone through their presentation and our history lessons for this evening. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Bob and kick us off.
Clint, thank you very much. I will give a little history as an introduction to how we got here from there. First of all, I want to recognize the two people who did the heavy lifting on this work. Mike headed the committee that we formed, and then Diane was the editor, so they did all of the tough work that it takes to create a book like that. A little history, how do we get started? This goes back in the history of Main Street Batesville organization. And in 2013, September of 13, the organization was reorganized. And I happen to recall that Diane, who's sitting next to me, was the first Main Street executive director back in 1984 and got all this started. Anyway, we reorganized in 13. And the board said, well, we've got to do something exciting to renovate and bring back Main Street. So we started the streetscape, and that's a whole different story of its own. However, we kicked around whether there had been any actual good writings concerning the Main Street itself. I talked to Nan Britton, and she said there are some articles that were included in some of the previous writings, but never anything dedicated just to the downtown. So that seemed like a logical project for us. And so in early January of 14, that's just a few months after the Main Street Board was reorganized, we formed a committee to look at this and see if we could actually do the research needed. I will read some of the, well, I'll read all the names actually, of those that we recruited and those who then said that they would stick with us. Nancy Britton, of course, as one of the historians in the area who's done a lot of work on that. Marilyn Clayback was unable to, she was recruited, but unable later on to participate, as was Gail Harley. George Langford, of course, a great historian, and he, of course, was in the final committee. Scott Lean, who was a English professor at Lyon at the time, accepted, but then he left later on. History. Oh, history. Okay, I'm sorry. I got English down here somehow or other. Craig Oglevy, who of course we all know is a terrific drawer. He has a lot of history background, and so he too became part of the committee. Twyla Wright was a good part of the committee. Lucy Yeager initially said yes, but then later had to decline. Diane Tebbetts was recruited. Mike West, of course, who I just introduced, is recruited as well. And Linda Matthews. There was one other gentleman named Ed Holler, since deceased, that agreed, but his health issues prevented that. So the first thing to do, of course, was to bring the committee together. And I had asked Mike earlier, I said, would you be willing? And by the way, Twyla Wright gave me a lot of leads on these because I didn't know some of these historians, and gave me a lead on Mike, of course. And he said, yes, I would, but we're going to have to meet a few times and do a lot of things that require meetings. And I said, that's perfectly fine. You are in charge. And so I just became a cheerleader after that point and was cheerleading the historians as they made their decisions and worked through that. First meeting, I looked at some of the notes. You probably can't see it, but this is my sheaf of papers that I had accumulated in the book writing process. Mike went out with his first message in February of 14, so he didn't waste any time. The committee was formed in early January 14, and he got right with it. He had his first meeting on March, and from that point on, he controlled the flow and the progress that are being made by the committee itself. I had an acquaintance. Let me back up just a second. In 14, Main Street, Batesville was able to receive the services of a gentleman who is an excellent advisor on streetscapes. So he was here. I got to know some of his accomplishments and his part of his working group. And so at April of 14, they heard that we were doing this, so they offered support. I said, well, thank you, but I think we can handle it ourselves here. But anyway, they were interested in the Main Street having its history written. Throughout the whole year of 15, and Mike and Diane will address this, they can give you the nitty-gritty details of all the decisions had to be made, how they were made, the review that was made, and what was done in order to move the book forward. So 15 was a year of work. Very honestly, strong work. We got to thinking about what's this going to cost, and so we got some preliminary cost estimates. And the first one we got was in 16, was about $23.50 a book. And we said, oh, okay, well, we've got to do something to make this book available to the general public. And so the decision was made, even though we tried grants, didn't quite fit, and the grants were a little bit unusual. So we said, why don't we get sponsors? And we therefore contacted a number of sponsors to sponsor at various levels. And those of you who had the books, you can see them in both the first edition and the second edition. So these sponsors then paid for the publishing. So we were able to offer the book, the first book, at $20 a copy. And by the way, when the book was published in late 16, it was published in time for the Christmas gift giving. Very fortuitous time. Late in January of the next year, we had sold 850 to 1,000 copies. So they went off the racks rapidly. And so the book was a great success. Monies went to Main Street organizations since they supported that. You might ask then, well, wait, how did you get to the Bicentennial book? Miss Diane, sitting next to me, suggested we ought to have a Bicentennial book because that's happening, in 2021. I said, great idea. Would you be willing to work it? And she gives me that look, as she usually does, knowing that I just hooked her. And she said, okay, I'll do it. So we had intended to produce the book in 2019. Things just took over. She was very busy. I happened to be occupied in other things. So it was delayed until 2020. So about in April of 2020, Miss Diane said, I've got it. We contacted the committee for suggestions, how we would change things. Suggestions were submitted. Diane again acted as editor, and her daughter, the lovely Nell, acted as the lady who put the pictures in and did things of that nature. And so the second edition was ready to be published and was published the end of 2020. Last comment I'll make, and I'll turn this over to Mike and Diane. People say, well, what is the difference between the first edition and the Bicentennial? There are a lot of significant differences. First of all, the Bicentennial is for bicentennial purposes. And the mayor has issued a proclamation, and then he had written a letter concerning the book itself. And so that's in the very first part of the book as it is. You might realize that from 15 until 2020, a lot has changed on Main Street. New businesses, new approaches. And so those all have been updated and included. The epilogue has been totally rewritten, meaning that this is what it is as of today on the bicentennial year. And so we were able to get those together with the able assistance of the committee headed, in this case, by Diane and Nell. So what I'd like to do, I'll turn it over to Mike and Diane and ask if they would go through some of the decision-making processes. How many pages? Who would have what? How long would each section be? Where would the photographs appear? How did you select the front page photograph and the back page and so on? So if I might, Mike and Diane, if you'd like to jump in there, and I might suggest, as we go through, I might suggest, well, how'd you arrive at such and such? Because you all made the decisions. I just sat, said, cheered you on. Mike, would you care to take it from there?
Well, as Bob said, we gathered in early, I guess it was 2015, and tried to divide up the responsibilities. Some of them were pretty obvious. Diane lives in the block 5th Street to 6th Street, so it was obvious for her to write on that one because she knew it very well. George Langford has previously done a lot of history on the lower part of Main Street, Old Batesville, and he had done a lot of research with his students, and so he was very familiar with those blocks in that part of town. So he agreed to take that part of the street. As we talked about what needed to be done to fill the kind of the scope of what Bob had given us to work on, we decided that he wanted us to concentrate on the downtown area, the commercial part of town. There had already been some excellent books written on the residential parts of Batesville, including Upper Main Street. Nancy Britton had done some writing on the churches in the 600 block of the street, and we eventually decided to include that as a transition area between the residential area and the commercial area. Except for Diane's house, pretty much all the blocks between State and 6th Street are commercial or government buildings. So even though that area had one time been primarily residential, it gradually transitioned over to commercial. So we felt like that section all the way from State to 6th was what we needed to concentrate on. And then we had to divide up the blocks among the writers. Originally, as Bob mentioned, he had recruited several potential writers, but some were not able to participate. So that left the group that he mentioned of active writers to divide up the remaining blocks. And they just kind of divide amongst themselves who did which blocks. Some of them did the whole block, both sides of the street, and there are a couple of blocks that each side was done by a different writer. So they did their own research. They had their own approach to how they gathered information, including going through tax records, abstracts, insurance records, interviews, and so on. We were able to tap the resources of the Old Independence Museum for a lot of pictures and other research material. And that really helped because they had a lot of great pictures. One of the more enjoyable parts was towards the end when we decided to sort out which pictures needed to go in the book. And so we would spread them out on the table and look at them. And that brought up a lot of stories and recollections of people who'd lived in Batesville long enough to remember what happened in a lot of those pictures. So that was one of the fun parts of the process. Other than that, we just met periodically every few months and would update each other on what we'd done, ask questions, try to refresh our memories, bring up issues that we maybe needed to talk about and clarify. It was just a lot of research and a lot of individual work by the writers, but also a lot of collaboration on common areas of interest. I would go back, I think, for a minute just to talk about how we came up with the whole concept of the book and the title of it. Back in the day, 200 years ago, when Batesville was just getting started, about the only way to get to this area was up the river. You could come overland, but that was a pretty tough way to go. So it was logical that where the little peninsula that's bordered by the river and Poke Bayou touched the river, kind of came to a point. That was where the Batesville main commercial area really started. And that was good as long as the river stayed in its banks. But once the river started flooding, they realized that that was not such a great place to be. And so eventually the buildings and the residences began to move up the street. And that gave rise to the title. We tossed around a lot of potential titles, and I think it may have been Craig that suggested the title Up from the River, because that's basically what the city did as it responded to the floods and dislocations in the lower part of town. And so gradually over the years, back in the early 19th century, the city migrated up the hill, up Main Street, and Main Street kept being extended up the hill until finally it was no longer, the main part of town is no longer in the flood zone. George, as I mentioned before, was knowledgeable about that area. And his section of the book has a lot of information that most people probably aren't aware of, because if you go down in that part of Lower Main Street now, there's really not much left there that could even suggest what the old town used to be like. But that one at one time was the center of town. The courthouse was there, and the jail, and all the commercial buildings, and several residences. So all of that eventually did move up the street to higher ground, and to the area from State to Central to Broad Street became kind of the commercial center of town. Oh, Diane, you want to add anything?
I had two responsibilities. I was one of the writers, so I had both sides of the street in my block, which is 5th to 6th. But I also had one side of the street on another block. Linda Matthews and I split the block, and I think Twyla did both sides of one and then part of another. So we divvied up, since there weren't enough writers for each block to have one writer. We had to sort of split things up. And so some of us ended up writing about blocks that we didn't really know very much about when we got started. The other responsibility I had was the editing, and my qualifications for that mainly were that I've taught freshman composition. I will never do that again, but I've also taught an advanced grammar class at Lyon College, so I'm just a little more informed about standard English grammar than your average person. So I was the one who needed to go through and make sure that everything was grammatically correct. And I would have to say that I probably didn't make even half a dozen grammatical corrections. These were all very good writers who were producing this. But another thing that goes with editing is when you have 5 or 6 different people writing, they each have their own style. And we did point out at the start of each chapter who had written it, but still it can be a little jarring when you're reading a chapter and you come to the end and the next chapter starts off and it's organized kind of differently, and it's just the wording, the number of personal stories that get included, the chapters, some of them were heavier on data, like Mike was saying, from the tax records, from the Sanford insurance maps, from, investigation that we did in primary documents, and others were largely based on interviews with family members of people who had been the first owners of the buildings that are still standing down there. So I had to do both of those things. And the first time through, I think we were all very pleased with how our book came out. But you know how it is, if you've ever written anything, it's perfect when you write it. But if you go back and look at it a year or two later, you discover that, well, maybe some things aren't quite as perfect as you had thought. And it wasn't that there were errors, it was just that in a couple of different chapters, there was information that was interesting information, but it didn't really have anything to do with Main Street per se. So we eliminated those 2 chunks in this second version because we knew we would be putting more information out about the new businesses that had come into being in the intervening time. Another problem we discovered as we used the book those first years to work on other historic projects was that you're reading through it the first time and you think, oh yeah, this looks, I can see, this is great, this is wonderful. Then you go back and it's like, wait, which building is this? There's not an address. I don't know which building they're talking about here. So in a couple of chapters, the writer had to go back and get the actual street addresses of the buildings. And that is important because people who haven't lived here in a long time or who haven't lived here ever and just are visiting and are interested and want to see what building we're talking about, it's very nice when you look in here and it says that that is 432 East Main. Well, you can find that, whereas if it's among the buildings in this block were this, which was this kind of business, and then there was this kind of business, and then this kind of business, and it was just a lot of change over time. Well, okay, so where were any of these, which buildings were these things in? So that was the main extent of the actual editing that was done, was removing the things that were not directly Main Street and then making sure that the addresses were clear in indicating where we knew for sure which building was used for which purpose. It was an interesting project because, I mean, I have spent a lot of time writing about old Batesville, mainly the residences, but of course then I was the Main Street executive director for the first 2 years, 3 years, I don't remember. I don't remember anything anymore. But I found out things reading this that I didn't know. So it was fun for me to be editing and reading along, and it was like, oh, I think especially of George's introductory chapter, where he has the maps that show where the islands were in the White River and how the river flowed and why the first docks were located where they were down at the foot of Main Street, because the river went right past there. Well, now, you go down there and it's just sort of sandy, overgrown, scrubby land. And it's like, how could a steamboat have tied up here? Well, they couldn't now. And so, things have changed. And just like the geography has changed, the businesses have changed and the owners have changed. And really, I think for this kind of book, ideally, about every 5 years, you would re-edit it, because it's a living organism. Downtown is not just a collection of bricks and sandstone and just dead buildings just sitting there being forever what they are. You can tell when you look at this and you look at the picture of the building that was the old Sterling Store building that since the book first came out has become the Royal on Main and Main Attire. And you look at what that building looked like to start with, you would never believe it was the same building. The same thing with the old Fitzhugh building across the street where the ballet school is now. What was originally there and what's there now, completely different. And it's just interesting to see how the town really is a living organism. And as time passes, buildings change, owners change, the mix of businesses changes. People say, oh, I remember when people used to come in on Saturday and you couldn't even walk in the street and everybody was going shopping, and now you just can't shop anywhere down there. And certainly if you think back 20 years even, downtown Batesville is not as heavily dominated by retail as it was then. Barnett's, the big store in town. I mean, that was their motto when we moved here in 1970, big, good-sized department store. And just lots of men's stores, women's clothing stores, jewelry stores, shoe stores, you name it. There were just all sorts of retail opportunities. Retailing has changed. Big box stores like Walmart, Home Depot, people like to go where they can just go in one building and run around and get everything. Or even more recently, you don't go anywhere. You just sit in your recliner and go to Amazon, and now you can even get your groceries on it, you know. So the way that downtowns operate has changed as society has changed. So now downtown is more of a specialty store place or an entertainment, dining, motion pictures. It's a place to go to do something, to go to Maxfield Park, to pick up a second run movie, to eat at one of the many restaurants that have located down there. But that's healthy. It means we're not dead. We all know of some towns in the vicinity that we will leave nameless for now. These downtowns are dead, 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 but not us. And that's a wonderful thing. I think that's all I can say.
Mike, would you tell us a little bit of the tough ones that you got handed where significant decisions had to be made on either the text or how many pages allotted or something? I'm sure there are a few things that remain in your mind that said, man, that was tough to get around when you finally did. Would you care to relate to those?
Well, one thing that comes to mind initially, and Diane alluded to it, we had to decide what the kind of the scope of the time period would be. We had potentially 200 years of history that we could talk about, but the historians recognized that there was a significant period represented by about 100 years that really represented kind of the traditional, typical downtown activities. And George pointed out that the first of these was the changing of the river course, and that's what Diane mentioned. This happened in the 1870s and was finalized about 1882 after several floods changed the course of the river, and which took the river away from the foot of Main Street. So as Diane mentioned, it's really no longer a riverfront Main Street down there anymore. That ended kind of the utility of the lower part of Main Street. It made it a little less susceptible to floods, but by that time, all the buildings had pretty much moved out. There wasn't much left down in that part of town. The other end of that 100 years was around the 1970s. And again, Diane alluded to the changing shopping patterns. A lot of the old traditional stores that had been in Batesville for decades ended up closing their doors in the 70s and 1970s and 80s as suburbs grew, suburban shopping grew. People perhaps became a little more mobile, were able to go to Little Rock a little easier, so that the writers decided together that 100-year period would be the focus of their writing. So even though the book covers the period before the 1870s, especially with George's chapters, and Bob wrote about the time after the 1970s and 80s, the primary focus became that 100-year period between the 1870s and the 1970s. So that was really a decision point that we all had to come to together so that we could begin to define what we were going to write about. The other thing that I might mention, Bob, on decisions was kind of the format of the book. A lot of you are probably familiar with these small format books. There's hundreds of them that have been printed. There's one about Independence County and lots of other local historic subjects. We decided that wouldn't really be the kind of format that we wanted, because although that was good for a lot of pictures with some captions, we wanted a lot more text to go along with the pictures. We considered a softback book, but we wanted this to be more of a coffee table book that you could put out on a table or out on beside a chair and could leave it out. It wouldn't just be a paperback book. We had to consider the size of the pages, how many pictures we could get on it, how big the pictures and the text would be. So those are all decisions we had to wrestle with and come to some agreement on. So I don't know that we had a lot of disagreement on it. It was just really a matter of coming to kind of a common understanding of what was the best, most suitable size for the book. And I think what we ended up with was a good size. It was the right size. It enabled us to put lots of pictures in, which is one thing we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to show lots of pictures, have good space for captions, and then still have lots of room for text.
If I could add there, as we went through looking for pictures that went with the businesses on the blocks we were we were writing about, we kept finding more and more other pictures that were more like streetscapes. There have been a lot of parades in Batesville, and of course they were always on Main Street until fairly recently. So the decision was made to add pages in the middle of the book that would just be sort of typical scenes from Batesville in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And so that I think has been fun for a lot of people because they look through and they remember, oh, that's my cousin there on that float. I remember she was Miss Batesville. You know, so it's a way to get more faces of more people that are part of Batesville's history, whether it's in big ways or little ways. We talked about possibly putting even more of those sorts of pictures in this latest version, but it was getting to be a little too long. So in the interest of keeping the book affordable, we did not add massively to the general pictures section.
I might, along those lines, I would add that in the introduction, there's a reference to Main Street Batesville website with potentially a lot of other information there that we couldn't put in the book, but I'm not sure that information is still there. It was there at one time, but I don't think it's still there. At least I haven't found it. I would.
That's why we had Google.
Yeah. Okay. I would mention one of the interesting thing that I found out myself about the way some of the streets in Batesville come together. As you go down Harrison Street, you see cross streets coming in at an odd angle. And George has gone to great lengths to point out that the original location of Main Street was parallel to Polk Bayou. And the streets adjacent then to Main Street were parallel to it and had that same orientation kind of in a northeasterly direction. But he says in 1840, Harrison Street was laid out in a due east-west orientation. So all the other streets that then are parallel to Harrison and go off of it at right angles have the traditional east-west, north-south grid orientation. So that's why you end up with so many streets in the kind of the main part of town that have these odd angles to them.
When you're trying to describe in a photograph, if you're looking, you know, what direction are you looking? Main Street looking southwest, northwest, southeast, northeast. That was a real chore for me. I actually had to kind of draw things out and then draw a compass arrow on the paper so that I could say, okay, I'm standing here, I'm looking down past the courthouse, downhill, and then I would put my finger on the paper and look at my compass arrows to be able to figure out, okay, I think I'm looking southwest, maybe. It's very confusing living on Main Street because we had lived here for a number of years. We lived out on College on the other side of the highway. And it was several years before I realized that Main Street and College bent when you cross the highway. You know, the North American grid on one side of the highway and then the 45-degree off angle of the old part of town. I was just la 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 la. I don't know when I realized that these streets aren't straight lines. So maybe the maps will help people who haven't caught on to that yet either.
I think I can bring this to a conclusion, Mike, and Diane, if I can, I have a few comments I'd like to present. First of all, this book has been used a lot as a reference book. And it's interesting, I go into places when we were selecting sponsors for the Bicentennial edition, and many of them said, you know, we use this all the time, referencing things that have occurred. So that's a plus for you all having produced a book that's factual and is presented in a great way. It was written, produced, printed locally. We had to send it away for the binders, but if we had a binder, we would have done it locally as well. So we tried to do everything as much as we could locally. We produced 1,000 more copies of the Bicentennial edition. And as Mike pointed out, it's a coffee table edition worth at least $45 or $50. But since we covered the publication costs, we can offer it at just the $25. The capstone in all this, the other day, we briefed the mayor on the Bicentennial, and we offered to him that the city sponsor, create, bury the time capsule. And he grabbed it like, as Miss Ray would say, a frog on a June bug. And interestingly, when we were talking about it, I had the book and I just kind of held it up and said, yep, that's got to be included. So the Bicentennial book, folks, will be in the time capsule. So if you're sticking around to 2121, why, you can say, hey, I was there. So I want to personally, and to all those who may be listening in on us, these two did it. All I did was I get my cheerleading outfit on occasion and cheerlead and make some suggestions, but without them, the project never would have gone anywhere. So thank you again for the excellent work that you provided on this book and the manner by which it came out.
And all the other writers too.
And absolutely, the other writing, as Diane pointed out, the writing and the researching and writing was spectacular. And so, but you needed a leader, and you had it right there with Mike and Diane. Got something else? Got some? That sounds good. I will read the question. I'll let some of these. Was it hard to? I can't quite read that word. On topic when researching. Help me on this, will you, Clint?
Was it hard to stay on topic when researching?
Okay. Was it hard to stay on topic when researching? I leave that left to Mike and Diane both.
Well, it was, yeah, that would help. It wasn't hard for me. I haven't heard any of the other writers say that it was, because, you know, we had our assignment and basically we knew what the time period was when our block was part of being the commercial downtown. So it wasn't like we had to start in 1821 and look for anything that might have occurred on, you know, like on my block in 1821. Well, my house was the first thing out there and it was built in 1842. So I knew I didn't have to look for anything before 1842. And then we all had access, I mentioned the Sanborn Maps earlier. Those were insurance maps, and they would send someone into these small towns and they would map the commercial areas of the town. And so each year that they did that, the maps got bigger and bigger, several pages long. And for the years that are covered, for every building that was standing when those people came, there's all this information that it was stone or it was brick and it was a barber shop or it was a, you know, a grocery store or whatever. And so that was very helpful. And because the maps ran from, you know, whenever, there were about, I think about maybe 6 sets of those. You just looked at those, and if your block wasn't on it, well, too bad. But you didn't then say, oh, I've got to find it, because there wasn't anything to find. So in some ways, the materials that we used organized what we looked for. And I didn't find it difficult at all. I was quite surprised to discover on my block that there had been two small buildings between where my house sits and where the bank now sits. And one of them was a milliner's shop and one was a photography studio. And at different times, they were different little businesses like that. Who knew? I mean, nobody remembered that those had been there. They had been gone so long, they were completely forgotten. So there were those little exciting things too that you did find that were sort of surprises, buildings that had come and gone and left no record except those insurance maps.
The next question relates exactly to what you were talking about, Dan. How did you determine where buildings that are no longer present or exist were originally located?
We looked at the Sanborn Maps.
You cheated, didn't you?
No, they're very good maps. We took
No.
advantage of the expertise of the cartographer or the insurance dealer, whatever. Those are quite interesting for a different project that I was involved in after the first book came out. I was looking at the building where Silo is now. And of course, when we moved to town in 1970, that was Street's Automobiles. It was an auto dealer and it had the shops for working on the cars. Well, when I kept going back and back in the maps that showed that building, it had started out as a stable. So it went from one form of transportation to the more modern form of transportation. And the building kept just getting a little bigger and a little bigger. The same thing happened where Bailey Ford used to be on Main, where City Hall is now. It started out as a fairly modest, like 2 storefront sized building, but over the years, it kept getting added onto and added onto. So you could see how individual buildings grew to hold bigger businesses than what they had originally been built for.
To add to that response, I would say our extensive collection of photographs helped identify what a lot of the buildings were. Because certainly a lot of the buildings that are in these old photographs are not there anymore, but just by relating existing buildings or other knowledge to the buildings in the photos, it would be possible to identify what was located in what location.
Where water was the big enemy at the beginning, and things were flooded and they molded and mildewed, and people would get sick if they tried to live there. And anyway, fire was the other big problem with the streetscape. There were a number of big fires in downtown Batesville in the 19th century. And, a whole block, one side of a whole block might burn. The building where Schwegman's is now, the corner building, the oldest part of their building, was the first place where the Barnett brothers were located. And that entire block burned except for their building. And it was really interesting because Mr. Nels, who's Charles and Nelson's, Jim's father, had written a story about that they had just gotten in a load of jeans cloth, which, if you know blue jeans, it's very heavy, very dense fabric. And they put it on the roof and wet it down. And it was that wet fabric that they had bought for their store that saved their building.
Interesting.
It's just, but you'll hear like the buildings that were next to that going east on Main Street, it would say what the businesses were that were in there that burned. And so you don't know what they looked like, but you know where they were because you know where the Barnett building was. And anyway, he's right that the photos were just very important in getting the story straight.
And that reminds me of one other discussion that we had towards the end when we were trying to come up with the title. It was suggested at one point that a good title might be something along the lines of Born of Fire and Water or something like that, because the two events over time that had shaped Batesville's appearance and location were floods and fires. And Diane mentioned the fires. There had been a lot of them. And that had a big impact on what the downtown area finally looked like.
I think the last question has been answered, but I'll ask it anyway. Did you run into any problems accessing necessary primary sources?
Nobody mentioned that. For one thing, many of us who write have written local history things in the past and kind of know where to look. But we're very fortunate that we've had an active historical society here in Independence County for many years. And the Independence County Chronicle, the publication that it puts out, lots of information there. And then the museum, besides its huge collection of photographs, it also has family histories and histories of some of the businesses. And so really between the museum and the historical society, the bulk of the basic resources were there. You know, the museum has the tax records, the land records here from, well, most of the history of the county. Some are still at the courthouse. Those are a little more difficult to get in to see, but there was no problem. It was just a matter of finding a time when there was somebody there who would let you in. I actually got locked in the vault at the courthouse one night. Yeah, they were leaving and I didn't realize they left at 4:30. So fortunately, I did have my cell phone with me. I was able to call someone to come back and free me from the dungeon.
Last question, what happened to the Adler building, ? Since it's still standing, I'll let you take the first part and I'll take the second part, Diane.
What happened to it? Well, for many, many decades, it suffered from deferred maintenance. So the roof was patched many times when it should have been replaced. Windows broke out, the glass was not replaced. And so water got into the building, and water is the great enemy of masonry buildings, just like fire is the great enemy of wooden ones. The back wall, the part that collapsed, when I was the Main Street manager, my Main Street office was upstairs in the front of that building, and I would go back into the Opera Hall part, and the floor stopped about 4 inches from where the wall started. It had separated that much just from the water damaging the masonry that held the bricks together. So that had been going on for decades. And then one night, it was just the straw broke the camel's back, and the people who were at the Melba heard a great resounding crash and the building shook. Sure enough, that was the back wall falling off. It was not somebody beating on it or, you know, a person causing damage. It was just too many years of things not being taken care of. And the present owner, Joey Markowski, is still pursuing getting it back together again. And I think Bob probably knows more about where.
Yeah, let me
is.
put a positive note on that. Not a spin, but a note. About a year ago, Shannon Haney, who had been an executive director at Main Street, wrote a grant to HUD, Housing and Urban Department, and it was a $500,000 grant. It was accepted. It was written for the city. Was accepted. So we believe, like collectively, we, Main Street and the foundation, believe that with the local bank that feels that they probably will assist in the other funds needed to repair it, that I'll put my name on the block, this one. Within a month or 2 months, we should see some activity. And Diane, by the way, modestly didn't approach this. She's been very instrumental in doing a lot of work with Joey and others to try to get tax credits and things of that nature. But I believe that the Adler will be saved. So and if we do that, we're all going to celebrate. Yay. Clint, I think we have answered all the questions, and I thank you for emceeing it.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to make sure I thank our wonderful historians, all three of them here, for coming out and giving us a wonderful presentation and just being here to share their knowledge on all of this. And I would also like to thank everybody viewing tonight for your attentive and wonderful questions and everything. Just to reiterate, Up From the River is for sale. And you can find it here at the museum, in the corner of 9th and Vine in the museum's gift shop, or you could also find it through the Main Street organization. Thank you all again, and we all hope to see you tune in at our next episode next month.